Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Google Drive integration for Integromat. And what we've got here is we've got a couple of different triggers that we can use. Now, technically, we can use any of these modules as our trigger for Google Drive. And we can basically set the scenario to run every so often to either upload the same file every so often, or update the same file every so often, or download the same file, or search for files. But most of the time, you'll be using a watch trigger, which is an ACID trigger, or you'll be using a search trigger. Now, the difference between an ACID trigger and a search trigger is a search trigger is always going to return as many results as it can. Okay, so if we have a look at the configuration here. We've got our Google Drive account. We can select our folder that we're going to look in, which we'll just look at the main folder. Hi, I just wanted to quickly mention the free Integromat course available on the link below in the description. It teaches you all the basics of Integromat, including how to work with arrays, how to iterate, how to aggregate, all those fun things that are pretty complicated to learn. It's all in that free Integromat course. The link is below in the description, and thanks for watching the video. And we can choose to watch for files, and then we can search for specific query terms. So we may want to search for files that contain PDF, for instance. And then we can, we'll do containing the term, and then we'll do a limit of 10. Now, if we run this, what will happen is Google will fetch as many results as it can find, up to, I think it is 20 or 50 results per search. That's the default. But it's going to order those results as the most recently created or updated files. Now, what that means is if you created a file 6 months ago, and since that time you've only uploaded 10 new files, that file that you created 6 months ago and never touched again is always going to be returned in this search, because this search is always going to return 20 files, and it's always going to return the 20 most recently created files, whether they were created 5 years ago or yesterday. Now, the same issue can present itself if you upload more than 20 files a day and you're only running this once a day. Well, then you're going to be missing out on files each day. And if you upload 20 files again the next day, well, then Google's got 20 new files to fetch, and so there may be some files in between that are missed. So the search for files and folders, generally it's not the best one to use. You'll want to use something like a watch, where you've got an ACID trigger. Now, an ACID trigger works similarly to the search trigger. However, an ACID trigger is going to mark its place in the queue, okay? So you may upload 100 files a day, and Google will process up to, in this case, 2 files, that's the limit. Well, then it will take 50 days to process all 100 files that you uploaded today, but it's going to keep its place. It's never going to go back to a file that it's already uploaded or done something with, because it knows where it finished, okay? And that's the crucial difference between the search trigger and the ACID or watch triggers, okay? Now, we can also have a look at different things. So we could watch for created time or watch for modified time. Obviously, they're two very different metrics that we're watching. And then we can also do some filtering here and look at different drives, etc. So, that's probably the main trigger that you will use if you're using Google Drive as a trigger. Now, once we've got a trigger for Google Drive, you may also want to use something like a search for. And you may want to search for a file when an email comes in or a task is completed, for instance, or you may want to search for a folder. Maybe you want to find a client's folder. And so you could search for the client's name within the folder names, because you may have named it that. And you want to search for the exact term or something containing the term, and get X number of results. So that's how you could use the search module. Now, you can also use other modules such as creating folders, uploading files, updating files, and then moving files between folders and trash cans. That's probably the most common modules that you'll be using. Now, to create a folder, pretty straightforward. You need to know what folder location you want to put that folder into. So let's just say we're going to put it in my temp folder. I'll be able to see all my other subfolders there. And if I want to, I can also put in the folder ID. Now, if we go to Google Drive, the folder ID is actually in the URL. So here is my folder ID. So I could just simply copy that and paste that into my scenario if I wanted to, making sure that I keep that first /, otherwise it won't work. And then if I wanted to put a subfolder in, say if I wanted to put this subfolder in, you'll notice that it's not actually creating a subfolder in the URL structure. And that's because how Google Drive keeps these folders is it's actually not a folder within a folder, not in the structure of things for Google. It's really just another folder. But for the actual user interface, it's sitting within another folder. But you don't have to nest the folders to map to them. You can just map directly to this folder ID and not have to nest it with any other folders. For instance, you don't have to do this sort of logic, which will be like so. So the first ID here is our first nested folder, and then this one here is the folder that we want to get into. And keep in mind those two /, one at the beginning and one between each nesting. You don't have to do that with Google Drive. Google Drive just knows that you want to put it in this folder, and it finds that folder with the ID and just adds that to that folder or changes that folder's name. So that's important to know with Google Drive. Now, you can also, if we click on here, and we just click on backups, if you change that to map now, a nice easy reminder is it's going to tell you what it's expecting for that particular field when you hit that map button. And so if you're ever unsure and you want to custom map something in there, that's a nice little solution to sort of hack around. Now, with the upload a file, it's expecting a data packet to be uploaded. Now, that means that you can't upload with a file URL. You actually have to download the file if you don't have it already, and then upload or push the data of that download to Google Drive. So how would you do that if, for instance, you just had a URL? Well, you would need to use the HTTP get a file module. You'd put your file URL into there, and then the HTTP module will give you the data as well as the file name. And you can map that into Google Drive, and then that will work correctly. Now, for the updating a file, the same logic applies in that you need to know the file ID, and the same logic applies that if you open up the file ID will show in the URL, and it will also show here on the right-hand side, or if you right-click and get details of the file. So that's how you can do that. You can also find it from selecting in a list to get the actual file ID, and then you can update your details there. So that's a little bit about how to work with Google Drive, and particularly how to resolve the upload a file function, and also a little bit about working with the folders and files with those different IDs in Google Drive.